Yo, what's up boys and girls, it's Swolelax here and I'm back at it again with another video. This time something just a little bit different. Today, let's talk about why Fusion Destiny is still bad. I am sticking to my guns on this one, but for a different reason than when I made the previous two videos. If you guys do not know, I've previously made two other videos, roughly 2 years ago, discussing Fusion Destiny, its implications, why I don't think it's that great. And while most of you have been eager to point out that the videos have aged poorly, I just want to say that it finally took 2 years for Konami to make Fusion Destiny worth it, and there was, at the time, an argument to be made that a competent hero strategy that could compete in the meta didn't need or require Fusion Destiny. They straight up just did not play the engine, and that's something that I think a lot of people overlook. However, after rewatching both videos and coming to terms with the current meta of Yu-Gi-Oh!, we're gonna talk about the previous videos, what I agree with them, what I disagree with them, and also some new and interesting things that have come up because of the current DPE meta. The first things I want to talk about are those two videos and some things that have aged like milk and other things that have held up quite nicely. Things that have aged like milk are some blanket statements like the card is just not that great or card is not that worth it. I think at the time that is true for reasons that we'll get into in a moment, but for the most part the card has evolved to be a really insanely good, amazing splash engine for almost every single deck that can afford to play it. Typically, decks will have space for 5 extra cards in the main deck and 1 card in the extra deck, and now the card is significantly better, not only because we have a new shiny toy to summon with, but we also have better main deck Destiny Hero monsters that we can play with Fusion Destiny, both in the hero decks and also inside of the non-hero decks. So overall, I was incorrect that the card is not good. It did take some fine tuning. Again, it took 2 freaking years for Konami to make it good, but it got there eventually. I can admit when I'm wrong. Now that has to do with the card pool once again. Destroy Phoenix Enforcer is that powerful of a card, but I digress. But overall, that's pretty much it. After watching the videos again, those are the only things that I really saw that I just didn't agree with anymore, but there are certain factors and certain points that I made that I think hold up to this day. I said things like you don't need it to make an OTK, which is definitely true. At the time, I referenced Vision Hero Trinity, which that card is kind of garbage. At the time, it was not the case, but I do think the extra deck was much less optimized when I made that video. And Vision Hero Trinity was a very viable option as things like Orcus were rolling around, which you could just summon it to a zone that Galtea pointed to in OTK. Conversely, there's also things like Access Code Talker that weren't inside the meta, so you could actually out a board without having to worry about it being over 5,300 points of attack. And nowadays, we do have easier ways to OTK with heroes. The combo lines are much more efficient, and modern players have essentially cut Trinity out of the extra deck entirely. That being said, you don't need Fusion Destiny to do OTKs. Ultimately, whenever you're seeing Fusion Destiny, still, it is more of a win more card. Another thing that I still agree with is that it's mathematically inefficient. For the most part though, this isn't a critique upon Fusion Destiny anymore and more or less a critique upon hero decks in general. Because like I said, there are better main deck hero monsters to play now that can offer you more value. But at the time, the hero monsters that we had available in our card pool weren't great. So while it still is mathematically inefficient, it's mathematically inefficient in a different way. One of the biggest limitations of the hero deck in the modern era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the fact that the engine requirements to play a hero deck is so strict. Take your 3 copies of Ion, your 3 copies of Ferris, your 1 copy or 2 copies of Increase, 2 copies of Shadow Mist, your mask changes, and also now your Fusion Destiny package. To play a legitimate hero strategy, it is still mathematically inefficient, but like I said, that's only really because there's so little wiggle room when it comes to building a hero deck in terms of tech choices or interesting cards. You're essentially required to play certain engine elements, and so you're essentially committing a large portion of your deck to playing the Fusion Destiny engine anyways. You were doing that before, but you're still doing it now. But whereas before was not required, it is 110% required nowadays. That's not necessarily an issue with Fusion Destiny exclusively. The hero deck in itself is not a very innovative deck at the moment. Because of the combo lines and how you have to play through interruptions in the meta right now, there is little to no wiggle room when it comes to playing a straight hero deck. And Fusion Destiny adds on top of the already mathematically inefficient hero strategy. It's not very flexible, it's very rigid, and the hero deck in general is not very good about establishing recurrable value. And thematically, this does make sense sense with the archetype, but it just doesn't help the argument. And somewhat last thing I said inside this video is that Dangerous and Dystopia aren't great. And I still agree with this. I think Dangerous is definitely much better in retrospect than something like Dystopia. And Dystopia has pretty much gotten completely power crept by Destroy Phoenix Enforcer. Dystopia is just really slow. You are almost required to play things like Dynatag or use up your Honest Neos, or you'd have to commit so much on the board to make Dread Decimator and Dynatag that you're much more susceptible to things like hand traps and interruptions, Nibiru. So it's a much more gambly, risky play for just effectively what is one interruption. And while similarly DPE is just one interruption, it's one interruption every single turn during the standby phase or otherwise that floats into itself. It's non-targeting, it offers value to you if you destroy your own cards. There's a lot of positives to it that Dystopia just really doesn't cut it. So I do still agree that those two cards, which again were the pretty much only practical uses for Fusion Destiny in the past, aren't amazing and didn't help the argument that Fusion Destiny was a great card. And lastly, and this one's just petty, Dynatag is gross. I still agree with all of those things for the most part. They're different arguments, but they somewhat still stay true, I think. But unfortunately, as the wise philosophers once said, with mo money comes mo problems. And there is new problems now that make Fusion Destiny bad. And while as before, Fusion Destiny could be labeled as inefficient, not necessary, a little eccentric, nowadays Fusion Destiny could be riddled as problematic. Destiny Hero Destroy Phoenix Enforcer is a monumental card when it comes to heroes and Yu-Gi-Oh! This card has shaken up the metagame so much that every single deck plays this engine. Practically every single deck plays this engine. It is so splashable, it is so good, and DPE is dope, but it is such a hard card to deal with and to out inside of any given game. Essentially against every matchup, it's extremely hard to deal with. Yes, you can play things like Forbidden Chalice or Droplets or Impermanence that help deal with this card, but the unfortunate thing about that is that after you negate its effects and you stop its destruction and Trident type popping effect, you still have to deal with the fact that if you want to out DPE, you either have to do one of two things. You either have to OTK your opponent before it comes back the next turn, and very few decks can really do that. Two, you have to deal with it in a way that doesn't destroy it, with some decks just straight up not having that option. It is such a resilient and strong card, it's bonkers. This card has literally changed the way heroes are played and how people play meta decks now. It's a free Pot of Greed setup for the next turn, it floats into itself, it's 2,500 attack points, plus it decreases monsters' attacks. And the more you read this card, it gets more increasingly apparent that this card is just so much harder to out with so many layers of protection. One of the biggest critiques that I had of heroes in the hero deck of previous years is the fact that we didn't necessarily have protection in a lot of cases. But with DPE, not only do we get protection in some form, we also get recursion and value that we never had. But it's not enough that hero players have this card. No, every other meta deck can essentially play this card better because of things like Predaplant, Verde, and Anaconda. With just two monsters, you yourself can also win every single game. On top of that, using them for something like Dagda and Scythe also creates problematic tendencies, all stemming from Fusion Destiny. But if Scythe or Dagda or Anaconda was removed from the game, would people still play the Fusion Destiny engine if it was at 3 and if the requirements for the engine were still around? I think yes. I think that Fusion Destiny is such a powerful card in terms of value that people would still play this engine if the conditions were somewhat similar for the main deck. Now, I have seen some people talk about banning Celestial to make the main deck portion of it a little more risky. I think that's probably okay. I don't like that take because I think Celestial is just fine, but I do agree with the assumption that it would change how people play Fusion Destiny as an engine outside of heroes. So I don't know, how do we address Fusion Destiny? How do we address the ever-changing meta landscape with Destroy Phoenix Enforcer now permanently being a part of our lives? How do heroes come back from this, and how do we really address the problems that Fusion Destiny poses? How do heroes use DPE and Fusion Destiny without it being a terror on the rest of the meta? And is there a solid, agreeable way to do so? But I think that's all I have to say about Destroy Phoenix Enforcer and Fusion Destiny at the moment. It's just an insane card, it's an insane package, and while I think that some things I said in the past were wrong, I think a lot of things that I said were actually still right. So I think the moral of the story is, you know, trust your boy. Anyways, I think that's all I have to say about DPE and Fusion Destiny at the moment. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Do you guys love it? Do you guys hate it? If you guys like this video, make sure to leave it a like. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I got a lot more videos coming in the pipeline, so stay tuned for that if you'd like to. But yeah, long live heroes and peace out.